So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome you and thank you very much for appearing in person to give evidence this afternoon on the European Union's upcoming entry-exit system. It's great to have DFDS and PO Ferries so that we can better understand the potential impact of the EES on the ferry industry. It is equally as important that we have Logistics UK so that we can hear about how EES may impact the movement of freight over the Channel and within the UK. All right? We've held several evidence sessions looking at the entry-exit system, and we've heard from travel and coach industry bodies, local authorities in Kent, and from those working with juxtaposed border controls at Dover, Folkestone and King's Cross. We have heard concerning evidence about the potential disruption and delays EES could cause for UK and other non-EU nationals when travelling between the UK and the EU, particularly through the tunnel and via the ferry at the port of Dover. I hope and very much expect that you will provide the committee with your insight and concerns about how the system will be likely to operate and any issues it may cause. Before we start, and for those watching at home, could you briefly introduce yourselves? Perhaps we will start with you, Jack, and then go to Nichola and then Jesper.
Thank you, Chair.
Jesper. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Jack Steer, P&O Ferries. I am Port Operations Director, so I look after all 9 of P&O's ports from an operational perspective. So EES upcoming is very close to my heart, and the challenges that we're going to face into, and hopefully the solutions that we can talk about today for that same challenge. I would like us today to think about the complexities that Dover has from the juxtaposed borders that you've just spoken about, but also the technological solutions that may or may not be available to us to enable EES to be a solution which is seamless for our customers and people that work within the port. I think we have an opportunity to talk today about the demarcation between ourselves as operators and the port itself, Dover, and how we are the end product, if you like, of the customer journey, and where the EES system will kick in and how that will impact potentially on the throughput in the port. But just leaves for me to say thank you for inviting me today. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk.
And just to get it on the record, your name is Jack Steer, so so the people who are listening know who you are.
Jack Steer.
Okay, and now Nichola Mallon, that's right, isn't it?
It is. Thank you, Chairman. My name is Nichola Mallon. I'm Head of Trade and Devolved Policy at Logistics UK. We have over 20,000 members across the UK, spanning international corporations right through to locally run HGVs. So thank you for the opportunity to come along today to talk about efficient flow of traffic through borders and the impact of EES as it currently stands on our members and UK-EU trade.
Thank you very much. And Jesper Christensen.
Yeah, my name is Jesper Christensen, but I'll respond to Jesper as well. I'm the operations director for DFDS down on the Channel, so takes care of the routes from UK into France, and also from France into Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And again, thank you for allowing us here today just to convey some concerns, but also about the path we think there is, that we have been on for some time to lead us out of this.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll ask the first question. So to better understand the context in which EES will operate, what is the current health of the ferry and road haulage industry, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic?
Will I take that from...
I'm going to ask Jack Steer first.
Okay.
I would describe it as a challenging environment. The COVID-19 pandemic had a huge impact on the tourist market in ferries. That is beginning to recover. However, I think the challenges we face around the new product that is EES poses further questions around Dover-Calais and the opportunity to make it a route which is easily accessible to everybody and gives everybody the opportunity to travel seamlessly into Europe. From a freight perspective, what I would say in part of the conversation today is that we shouldn't separate the two. So when I talked about the impact of COVID on the tourist side of our business, freight continued through the COVID pandemic It was impacted, but nowhere near as largely impacted as the tourist trade. But Dover is in a unique position in that I believe the two walk hand in hand with each other, the freight market and the tourist market. One doesn't work without the other. And if there is a challenge with one of them, it does have an impact on the other. And I think EES is one of those things that we need to look at the context of both freight and tourist in one, rather than looking at either tourist or freight as an individual piece.
Thank you. Nichola?
Yes, I would agree with Jack in terms of our membership. They are operating within a very challenging environment, many under very tight profit margins. It is a very resilient sector, but it has had to absorb and adjust to a lot of challenges, post-Brexit trading environments and changes, COVID, as you rightly mentioned, but also price energy shocks, the war in Ukraine, supply chain difficulties, inflation, and obviously we have the ongoing situation in the Red Sea, diversion of trade, and additional costs being faced by shippers and so forth. So it is a very challenging environment, but what I would say is that the short straits is a critical route. It's a critical EU-UK supply chain, and it's one that is very heavily used by our members, and so we want to do everything that we can to ensure that solutions are put in place so that we're reducing as much as possible the time that it takes for processing passengers, because it has a knock-on impact on freight through the juxtaposed borders.
Thank you very much. Jesper?
Just to echo what they're saying, COVID, of course, had quite a hefty impact on our passenger traffic because it was almost non-existent. Freight, however, continued, but of course there were certain factories and all that were shut doing it, so there was less freight. That has sort of come up again, but Brexit, when we are talking freight, has had a bigger impact. I would say that on some customers it's just not viable anymore, so they had sort of shared away. So it's been very challenging to get to the old levels of freight traffic. The tourist traffic is returning. We will still like to see some more, so we get back to the old sort of pre-COVID days, but it is returning. But it is also based on the fact that it's an efficient way to get into Europe if you want to take your car, and it also that it stays efficient. So if we are to implement the EES as some of the suggestions has been of how the system will work, that will severely impact the last bit of the recovery and maybe even take a step back on the tourist side. So
if I could come just on that last bit you mentioned on returning to pre-COVID levels, in terms of numbers, Nichola, what's your prediction? Do you think we're going to get back to pre-COVID numbers in the next few years?
Yeah, we would hope so. I mean, we have seen at post-Brexit that there has been a dip in terms of exporting, particularly among smaller companies to the EU. We're obviously, as a sector, very mindful of the border target operating model, the 3 stages of which go live this year, which will introduce new import controls on EU SPS goods, and then in October, at the same time as EES is to come in, we'll have safety and security checks and controls as well on EU and rest of world imports. I suppose from our members' perspective, they're in an environment of quite considerable change. There is a cumulative impact of change, particularly on our smaller members who don't always have the resource to make sure that they're fully informed and adapt. So yes, certainly there are challenges, but the short straits, as its name indicates, is a key route. It's highly efficient for our members, particularly for just-in-time supply chains. There's a high level of frequency, and I think that's demonstrated by the numbers. If we look at the Channel Tunnel, there's about 1.6 million trucks go through the Channel Tunnel every year. About 2.4 million trucks are going through the Port of Dover, and that's about up to 10,000 HGVs per day in Dover. So it is a key route for the haulage industry, and it's a key route in terms of just-in-time supply chains, but also automotive parts that need to get across to EU assembly lines, with critical time frames.
Thank you. And Jack, on the same issue about returning to pre-COVID levels.
Yes, as Jesper said, we're not there yet. The ambition is that we will get there and we will continue to thrive. I think as I would look at EES as the next big hurdle I think that we face, one of the questions that I would be posing and asking us to think about would be what does the solution look like for that? How do we get to a point where EES actually just becomes part of a seamless journey? And one of the things I think that would support all of us, including what Nichola has just talked about her members, is how do we upstream as much of the process of EES, which currently, in its current form, we're unable to do, and the Port of Dover are unable to do. However, our view would be whether we use an app, other technological solutions to be able to do the test that these customers, these passengers will need to undertake outside of the port, away from the port, in effect in their own time, in the same way as we would apply for a passport today. Yeah. What technological solutions can we find that remove this from what I believe is a unique situation? If we think about Dover in the way that it is set up and the environment that you're going into, if you go on holiday with your family, and let's assume you're a family of 4 and you're going to an airport, EES actually becomes quite a simplistic thing. You're in a sanitized environment. You're walking up to a hardwired piece of technology that you put your fingers on to do your fingerprinting. It's there, the lighting's correct, the environment is correct. You're lined up, you're queued up as individuals. When you have your photograph taken and the other pieces of technology that need to do the other elements of the testing, it's all done in that sanitized environment. Now imagine yourself in a port environment with juxtaposed borders, and you've got yourself, your good lady, your husband, whoever that might be, and your children in the car. Now you've got to do that in an environment where it could be raining, it's windy, you've got to roll the windows down. You have to have in the current technology, you have to have your hand on the fingerprint reader perfectly correctly so that it reads. All of that potentially adds in time and difficulty in what I describe as a unique environment of Dover Port.
Yes. Next question, Greg Smith, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It's very much on those practical points that I want to ask the questions. We've heard from the port at previous sessions about how they plan to implement EES. But can you give us a little bit further to what you were just saying, Jack, your interpretation of how Dover is going to implement the necessary EES facilities? Has that evolved over time, or has it remained pretty much this is it and this is how it's going to end up? And how many Schengen border guards do you think are actually going to be required to oversee it?
Wow, Mr. Smith, those are some fantastic questions. First of all, thank you very much. And I think there are other people probably better placed to answer some of them, but I can give you my view. I can give you what I believe. So in regards to your question on Dover Harbour Board, DHB, and the solutions, that has been constantly evolving. And I don't think we're sitting here today with a definitive, this is what the end product will be. It's why I would be suggesting that actually I think we need more time. We need more time as a collective, not just Dover Harbour Board, but us as operators, Kent, the wider community. I would include yourselves in that. I would include the EU and the French government. I think we all need to be talking about, is October really the right time for us to go live with a product that is still evolving? So I'm sitting here today and I've just talked about the fact that I believe there's technological solutions that would ease this pressure. Would we be able to get those ready? And I'm saying we as a collective, I'm not saying us as an individual company, but would we be able to get those solutions ready in order for us to be able to have this smooth transition of customers through the port, whether those be tourist or freight? If I consider where we are in this chain of events, so to describe it for you, if you can imagine today, you go into Dover as let's talk about a tourist customer coming into Dover or a freight customer. You'll first come to French Border Police and you will hand over your passport, you'll go through those checks. Then you go to UK Border Force. Then you would go through a potential security check if you are chosen to be one of those checks. And then right at the end of this chain, you come to DFDS or P&O Ferries in this case. And we will then board you onto your ship. EES adds a layer in before all of that. Mm-hmm. Before you get to that first touch point, which is today, around having your passport checked and think back to my car of 4, you have to now do the fingerprinting, the biometric testing, etc., etc. And we are talking about that being done, in effect, on a tablet, as some of you are sitting in here today with in front of you, whether it be iPad or whatever that might be. I think you are going to therefore layer on consistently added time and throughput going through the port. If you can keep the port as it is today, with the checks as they are today, again, I'm talking about tourist passenger, but the same principle applies to freight, and you remove that, you push that back upstream away from the port in the same way as I've just talked about having a passport issued to your good self, then you remove that extension of time in the port.
The border guard?
I think that's a great question. I do think it's a great question. I don't know at this point. I'm not in a position to be able to say I think we need X amount of border guards, and I think it is driven by the time of day and time of year and the seasons. So there are peak times where this will become challenging. So if we were to take a normal day of the week where actually there isn't a lot of traffic, you can have less border guards, whether that be UK Border Force or whether that be French PAF. The reality for me is when it's in peak is when you have to have everybody in the port that you possibly can. And there's a finite amount of booths that they can use, and we would expect all of those to be used.
Just before I bring the others in, the technological solutions that you mentioned in there that would make this better, if not October, when? When would those technological solutions, or is this a how long's a piece of string question?
I think it's how long is a piece of string question from a point of view of where is the technology today and when could those that need to get it in place get that technology in place. If I consider us as an operator, we have the training, the technology that we need to have in place. That's why I think it's important to remember the chain that I spoke about. We're at the end. We don't have to get involved with these new tablets, with the technology, the biometric testing, etc. So those that will be producing that would have to give you that answer. I don't know when that would be, so your phrase, it is an element of how long is this piece of string. However, it is possible. It can be done. I could go home today and do things with fingerprints on my iPhone using the technology that it does today. So there is a way to do this. It's how we get there as a collective.
Jesper, maybe you can give a perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you. So if we're talking about the history of it, it was sort of set when they passed a law in the EU about it. And we have then spent a lot of time trying to sort of, forgive the word, educate a lot of people about what actually happens at the border when you are not in an airport, but when you are with cars. And that has taken a long time. A lot of the solution or ideas that has been thrown up by both us but also others then has to go back, but it usually end up stranding around the legislation. Does this comply with the legislation? And this is why we are still so close to the date without a full and final solution into it. I think that the technology is the only way. When they decided to make the EES, it was a sort of fait accompli. We understand that there will be an extra check, and that is nothing we can do about it, and we will accept that. If it was a digital and a simple process, then it shouldn't take that much more, and we can still operate the same way we do today. But the suggestion there is right now where you end up having to do a manual process with quite a large body of people doing these pre-registration outside of PAF booths, that is not an efficient way to run such a fast port. And the throughput, when we are looking at it, is just not big enough. We are then also looking at that the Port of Dover is trying to shoehorn as many infrastructure they can into to PAF in order to get more border guards to it. But even with the solution there is presented to us today, that will not be enough for the peak times unless we have some kind of upstreaming that controls in a digital way, where that registration do not have to take place in front of PAF. We just have to rely on PAF making their normal controls, but everything else has been done upstream. We have seen elsewhere in the world, also UK, using apps very successful. So we had put a lot of sort of faith in that we could upstream it. This is also the way we do it ourselves. We have to deal with coaches and things like that, and we don't like 5 people have to go in to try to check in a coach. We upstream it. We have an app. It is simple. And if that could work, and it could be ready, but that is a big if. As far as we understand, EU Commission or a company under that will supply the software, but each member state has to have the facing of it, so that could take some time to get it to work. We are past the summer by the time and the Olympics by the time they want to implement it in October. So we would be looking to the half term, also to Christmas, but definitely for next year's Easter and summer to have it ready if we are to manage those peaks. I think it's also important just to understand that the tourist arrives in peaks. There are certain times, there's holidays, and they arrive in a lot of them that comes at the same time. Freight is a little easier for us in the sense that they are there all the time. But coaches, they also goes with the holidays, but there are more sort of times where coaches go, which means we are more likely to see peaks of coaches than we are likely to see peaks of a lot of cars coming. And right now, the solution they are presenting to us for coaches without a digital solution, that is, should we say, the scary part. And the coach industry is one of those that has really risen after COVID and come back. And again, school groups are again being popular, both from the continent coming into UK, but also UK school groups going out, but also people going on holidays and all that. So it's a good market for us and it's an evolving market.
I appreciate that answer. Nichola, do you have anything to add on your perception of implementation at the Port of Dover, how it's evolved, other challenges?
Yeah, what I would just say is that you have a number of factors that are quite unique and are colliding. You have the uniqueness of the juxtaposed border. You have the site constraints at the Port of Dover. We also have the fragility of the strategic road network in Kent. So I'm sure we'll touch on this, but Operation Brock is relied upon to try to manage peak passenger traffic, and it's actually freight that bears the brunt of that. And the other factor is the just-in-time produce, which cannot sit in the back of lorries. The longer it sits in the back of a lorry, the shorter its shelf life. The shorter its shelf life, the less value the produce is, and the lower the outcome is for the UK consumer as well. That's why I would echo the comments that have been made about the need to find that upstream digital solution which takes the burden of registration away from the physical border and will help to ensure that the smooth flow of passenger and freight traffic, which I'm here to represent.
That's helpful. I'm mindful of time, so I don't want to go on too much, but one last brief one on this. Is all of you have mentioned upstream digital solutions, but I'm yet to see one. When and where is this mythical upstream digital solution actually going to come from? Is it even in development? Is somebody developing it? Is someone, good for them, going to make a lot of money out of it? Where is it? Everyone's saying it's the answer, but there doesn't seem to be one.
Well, my understanding is that there is an app that's under development on the European Union side. There's a foundational layer of that which has been developed by the European Commission. The member states have to kind of tailor it for their needs. There has been a delay on that, and there is an anticipated implementation date around kind of the summer of 2025, but I haven't seen the specification of that. I haven't seen how much of the burden of registration it will be able to facilitate, but I'm sure among us we can get you some further information on that and get that to the committee, Chairman.
That would be helpful, thank you.
David, I think you wanted to
Just a very brief question, again on the issue of upstreaming the provision of details. As I understand it, the provision of biometric details has to be done at the border in the presence of an EU border official. Has anyone ever suggested, you might know, Jesper, to the European Commission, that they could actually do that in a number of central locations, well away from the port? That you could have booths, for example, where EU border officials are based, and they could actually supervise the provision of those details there. What is the magic about it having to be produced at the border? Has anyone ever explained that?
If I'm to answer that, and that's a good question, I would say yes, we have spoken to them about where does it have to take place. One thing is that we have to remember that this is a juxtapose, so this is French border guards that are inside UK, and we can't have them travelling around all sorts of places. And as I understand, but I don't want to speak for PAF, but I understand they are not interested either to sit in all these locations. But that was a solution. We, of course, perhaps also relying a little on that some of our customers will have gone to an airport that has registered before they show up at us, and that could help us a little bit, yes. The ones who do travel. But that could be a way to do it, to have an upstream and take it offline, if you like. The only thing is that if you're sort of taking and saying this is the way to do it, that we get 2 big car parks and we bring people in there, it doesn't really take away the time it takes for a customer to go from A to B in the center.
And that's why I'm wondering why this whole process can't be done maybe several days or weeks beforehand at some location, for example, in central London or Liverpool or Manchester or whatever.
There was a suggestion also that people should be able to go and register in advance, same as if you want a passport or something else, you do it in advance. And this is also, when we say it's a digital solution and an upstream, it doesn't have to be an app for us, but it just means that we take that control or this registration off right in front of path, and we can have normal traffic that doesn't have to go through this part.
Is your industry actually lobbying for such a solution to the European Commission?
If I'm to answer, yes, we are both from DFDS, but also together with Port of Dover, lobbying for it and has been talking with EU and are trying to push forward that this app will be developed.
That would completely get rid of the problem. Mm-hmm.
That is our hope. If we could get it to work to the standard that we would like, then yes, it would alleviate most of the problems we are talking about.
Thank you very much.
With all this whizzing technology, it does seem astonishing that there isn't a well-known system already in operation. It's because we're not just the only country in the world affected by this. I mean, there are borders with seas. I mean, it's not an unusual situation to have to go to an island nation. So I just can't understand at the moment why somebody hasn't come up with a really good system. But John, you...
Well, notwithstanding all this going upstream of what's currently proposed, I just want to ask, what are the consequences of what's currently proposed in terms of freight and passengers through Dover to the EU? Because there's a lot of speculation here, but as it currently stands, what are we looking at here? Should we go that way, Jack?
Thank you for the question. As it stands today, I think it is fair to say that we are all nervous about the impacts of EES as it stands today. The solution as it stands today would mean that you would need to have a large number of people that were in effect managing these devices in the port to enable the throughput. And I think, as we've already spoken about, the evolving nature of what the solution looks like makes it problematic. My nervousness really is that we are talking 7 months. 7 months between now and potentially going live. And I think that is another reason why we have to apply some pressure around looking for an extension to that. I think the unique circumstance that we have in regards to Dover and the throughput, whether it be a freight or tourist, those peak moments in time, whether it be half-term, school holidays, etc., from a tourist passenger point of view, potentially cause us challenges in the future.
You must have gamed this out, though, in terms of specific likelihoods of what you're facing, right?
Yes.
I mean, we've all seen the 14, 15-hour queues, and obviously that's the summer, and this is being introduced later. And I know you're nervous. Can you add a bit of colour to what we might be witnessing down the road here?
Yeah, I think that is. You've seen the reports that Dover Harbour Board have produced, and they've had independently mapped out, haven't they? This is what a potential issue could look like in the port of Dover. So we're all aware of what those potentially could look like in those peak times. We need to be really clear, though. That isn't going to be all the time. That will be in those peak times. And Jesper's quite right to highlight things like coaches. Going back to my example of the car and having a family of 4 and the challenge that poses, and that adds to that peak time delay. In a coach, imagine 75 people in there and going to do that in that environment. And so I don't know, sitting here today, exactly what that impact is going to look like on any given day. What I can say is everybody that's involved will do their best to make sure that we are ready in whatever form we need to be ready. What we are looking for today is support, in effect. We're looking to, as we were asked to, share what our feelings are, what we believe the challenge might be, but also to look at solutionising it. We've had a lot of conversation today about the potential upstream digitalisation digital, all of those kind of things. I think the challenge that we really face when we start to talk about those digital solutions is the legislation that's sitting behind this.
Right.
So currently the legislation is telling us it has to be done in front of the border police. Then therefore we need a legislative change at the Port of Dover, which may be different to other areas, but for the reasons I've already given, I think it's important that we seek your support in trying to get to a point where we can have that legislative change.
I press you as well on Nichola on this. I mean, as it stands now, what we're looking at, notwithstanding all the desire to get upstream and the technological remedies that might be on hand. You know.
So if EES was to be introduced tomorrow, as is, it would have a big impact on passenger traffic and queues, particularly at peak times, and that would have a significant knock-on impact on freight. We also anticipate that the impact will be relatively persistent. Obviously, at the start, there will be significant disruption, but with people's holiday patterns, you may find that the re-registration period means that at peak times there is a continual high level of registration, and obviously then the impact in terms of freight will be significant. I don't want to go into the area of conjecture, but I do think that it is fair to say that we do have concerns about impacts on imports and exports. I've made the point around the just-in-time produce and those particular supply chains. If there are delays, it is the reduced shelf life, reduced value. There is the increase in the potential for waste, none of which is good for the trader, the haulier, or UK consumers going into their local supermarket. I've also referenced the combination of the border target operating model and the EES. And what I would say there is, as people are adjusting to the new import controls, that is likely to have an impact in terms of the level of imports as business try to adjust to that. So I think it's fair to consider that as a factor in the mix. Our big concern as well is around traffic. As I've said, the strategic road network in Kent is vulnerable, and freight picks up the burden of that. And freight is also the face of that. When it causes, Operation Brock does cause considerable disruption to communities and businesses in Kent. And freight, through no fault of its own, is the face of that and is severely impacted on it. I would also talk about driver welfare issues. That is a long-standing issue. We need to have better and more driver welfare facilities, and we would be concerned that it could make this whole route more unattractive for both UK and EU hauliers, that if there is significant disruption and delay, we know that drivers are already battling with the issue of clandestine entrance into the back of vehicles. So there's a lot of issues that drivers are having to grapple with, and I think if we were to put EES on top of that in its current format, where we are having so much friction at the border, it would have quite significant consequences.
Very clear, specifically on the freight question as well. Jesper, can I ask you, maybe specifically on the ferries as well, because all the assumptions are that passenger movements are going to increase as well as this is being introduced, so it's not just a static picture, there's a sort of dynamic of increasing passenger numbers.
What do you mean about the ferries?
Well, what would be the likely impact on
the ferries?
Yeah.
So if I just go a little bit back, the real concern we have is that we have plans to deal with congestions as it is today, but once it builds out of the port, when we are talking tourist traffic, that is becoming a concern to us. There is a system today for freight drivers, Operation Brock, as you mentioned. I don't think that you can find anybody that really likes it, but it's something that works. We've had it for many years, and it's the only way that at the moment we can deal with it. Tourist traffic is a different animal altogether if that starts building out of the port, and this is where our concern really is, that because now we're also talking welfare of them, but it congests the roads to the sense that it blocks the road. So it very quickly becomes a big issue. We have seen before where there has been disruption to the border control for whatever reason, where there actually builds up quite big queues in front of the controls. The ferries will then, at some stage, have to leave without any traffic because we also want to bring in traffic. And this is just a circle that we keep going around and around. So we have at times had, quite a lot of traffic sitting waiting, but we have to leave to go or pick up traffic to come in order to service the whole supply chain. And that is not an efficient way for us at all, because it just means that those customers, once they are passed through, we need to find space for them and keep them going. So, in most cases, I would say the issue we are at is not about our checking capability or the carrying capabilities, because we don't overbook our vessels. We only book to the capacity we have. So it's not like we are standing with a lot of the cars or freight that we don't know what to do with. It is more a matter of can we get them through the controls and to our check-in in a timely fashion, so we can move them also in a timely fashion.
Clear. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Just before David Jones comes in, you mentioned legislation. Have you been making representations to the European Union about this?
Yes, as Jesper said, we have all been involved in the conversations, both in Lille and further up the chain. The reality behind it is we see that as that's a roadblock for us, in effect, pardon the pun, given what we're talking about today, but that is a roadblock for us in that if the legislation will only allow this to happen in the Port of Dover, any of the digital solutions we've talked about won't come to pass. However, there is conversation already about an app potentially coming at some point in the future. Therefore, the legislation would have to change in regards to that at that point anyway. Why couldn't we do that sooner? Why can't we have a change to that legislation which enables the app to be the answer to what we're talking about? But at the moment, it's restrictive for us.
Heaven forbid that they would actually not move fast enough. But is there any sense that they're not that concerned about this?
No, I think there's open conversations being had across many different forums around exactly this subject. I think it's about how do we find the solution to that. What is it that's going to work for everybody that enables this free flow of traffic that we've talked about today?
Are you aware that our Department of Transport is having, or any other government agency or otherwise, is having discussions with the EU about this? I mean, you're expressing a considerable urgency. You're concerned about timetable. You're talking about you can't really see, as far as I can make out, that you're going to be able to get all this done in November. You know, if there's urgency, why are there no urgent solutions?
I think that's a question that would have to be posed to others. My view on it, Chair, is that October is too soon. That is my personal view. As we sit here today, we've already talked about the evolving conversations, the evolving solutions that may or may not come into place in the Port of Dover. I genuinely believe that October 2024 is too early for us to put EES in as a product as it stands today, for all the reasons that all of us have spoken about earlier. Therefore, if we were to push that back, and I'm just putting a date and a number on it rather than trying to give a definitive, but if we were able to move it back a year, continue all of those conversations, work collectively to find the correct solution for EES, that has to be beneficial to everybody. And it also has to be beneficial for all the reasons that Nichola's talked about for UK PLC as well. This is not a Dover-centric problem. This is something that will have tentacles and will spread through the UK from a financial point of view.
And are you suggesting that people have asked, seems implicit in what you've said, somebody has said there ought to be a year's delay or something of that kind, and what's the reaction?
That is what I am saying. That is what I am
asking for. You're a witness before this committee, and you have authority in the sense that you're well aware of the problems. And I'd like to know, for example, whether Nichola and Jesper actually disagree with you. I mean, are you all agreed that it would be better if we delayed it for a year?
I think for this to work, given the unique factors around the juxtaposed borders, that we need to make sure that implementation has a timeline that ensures a workable solution for the short straits can be found. Because if we don't, there will be significant delay and disruption. We have been supporting, Logistics UK has been supporting the Port of Dover in its engagement with French and EU counterparts. We have also been raising this issue with the Department for Transport, and we have standing frequent meetings and with Cabinet Office as well. And in recent response from Baroness Neville-Rolfe, just on the 14th of February, she confirmed in that letter that the government is, through the Home Office, is engaging and working hard with French and EU counterparts to try to get that digital bespoke solution and to have the flexibilities that we need for both UK and EU trade.
Right, well, point taken. I hope that we'll make sure a letter goes to the appropriate people and see whether we can put a bit of a pressure on them, because more than a bit, because it sounds to me as if it's a serious problem. David?
Yes, Nichola, just on that last point, it strikes me that these proposals are as much of a headache to the French authorities as they are to the British authorities. Are they expressing concern?
Yeah, well, it's a symbiotic relationship, isn't it? The outbound flow of freight needs to get across to offload and also pick up loads that need to be delivered back, to state the obvious, on UK shelves. I suppose with EES and the juxtaposed borders, the disruption will be particularly acute on UK soil and in areas where we have site constraints. So there is that additionality. There's also the issue of kind of EU nationals who are drivers who don't have to be subject to EES and so forth, but of course they're going to get caught up in the traffic as they are segregated through Operation Brock, which seems at this point in time to be the way of mitigating the kind of traffic disruption, which I don't think any of us would agree is really sufficient.
And Jack and Jesper, do you have concerns about the welfare of holidaymakers as a consequence of the implementation of these proposals? And are there any particular groups you're concerned about? And what are you and your partners doing to mitigate the impact upon these groups?
Do you want me to say that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
In regards to welfare for all of our passengers, freight and tourists, we are always concerned if there were to be delays going through the port. And I think Brock is the perfect example of where, when there are delays, in effect, there is very little that we are able to do from a welfare point of view. We would have to rely on the local authorities, etc., to provide that. Anything that is within the port, absolutely correctly, so that it was within our purview, we always make sure that any welfare is provided and we look after all of our customers, whether it be freight or tourist passengers, and we would always continue to do that.
Are there any particular categories of passenger you're concerned about?
We're always concerned, and age comes into that question, would always come into that question, whether that be of small age or elderly. When we start to talk about disabilities, etc., there are certain groups of people that are always going to be slightly more problematic from a point of view of welfare, i.e. making sure that they are looked after in the right way than others. If we consider, again, go back to what I talked about earlier in that car of 4 people, it's a hot summer's day and you're stuck in these queues. As it currently stands, it wouldn't be us that are able to go out to those customers and give them welfare. However, we have a good relationship with the Port of Dover, and those are the kind of planning mechanisms that we have in place to ensure that whenever anybody is on port property as such, they are always going to be given welfare and given provision when they're in that kind of situation. But I do think it's a good thing to visualise, to think about those extreme examples rather than just a 10-degree grey kind of day in London as it is today, and it probably is in Dover as well.
Jesper?
Yeah, similar to Jack. When we have delays or people waiting, we are always concerned about it. When they're inside the port, then we will look after them. That's part of how it is with the travel rules, that we'll make sure that they're looked after. But once they're out on a public road, there's very little we can do. We work together with the Kent Resilient Forums, that is through Kent County Council and all the emergency service to see what we can do. But again, it'll be somebody else that needs to effect that, because they need to have permission to operate out there. And again, freight is a problem in itself, but a lot of the drivers are in many ways self-sufficient because they're used to be on the road, but would like to see some facilities, whereas tourists or coaches being stranded there, it's entirely different because the requirements is much bigger on them if they're stuck there for a long time, and that would be a concern. And this is also why we are concerned about the implementation, that we just don't want to see it ending up on the public road sitting there.
Maybe if I could come back,
yes.
One of the things Logistics UK would be keen to see is that there is a tracking system, either led by National Highways or the Department for Transport, who can track the waiting times, say for the first driver in the queue, so that we're able to then trigger a kind of driver welfare process. As Jesper said, drivers are very self-sufficient. They will have food and water in the cab, but there are toileting facilities that will be required. And one of the difficulties is ensuring that drivers drivers don't lose their place in that queue. So this is an issue that predates EES, but certainly I think with EES gives an added impetus in terms of trying to make sure that we do have that structure and that process in place.
Can you explain how that process works?
Well, at the minute we don't have a process. So, for example, we would rely on anecdotal feedback from our members about how long they have waited in a queue in Brock, for example. And what we believe should happen is that government should lead an independent process where it's able to track that. So we have data, we're able to capture the data and the evidence about the waiting times, and then able to put in place a welfare provision process so that we're making sure that we're looking after our drivers, because obviously passenger welfare is hugely important, but too often the driver gets forgotten about in this process. I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're aware of the circumstances that they're having to endure, and that we do what's necessary to support them and look after them in these very difficult circumstances when they arise.
Just so I fully understand it, this is a problem now.
Yes.
Are you able to estimate how much worse it would be once EES has been implemented?
Yeah, so I would say that it's difficult to quantify the weight, but certainly if we were to introduce EES as it stands at a peak passenger period, there would be significant knock-on effects. For example, the Kent Resilient Forum is meeting tomorrow to consider Operation Brock in terms of the situation that will arise during the Easter holidays. So it is Operation Brock is something that either through preventative or mitigation measures has been deployed, and as I've said, it's not passenger traffic that is segregated, it's freight traffic, it's segregated and it's held back on that, and depending on the length of time that a driver's waiting, it can raise driver welfare issues.
There's no modelling to establish what sort of additional weight there would be as a consequence?
No, my understanding is that there's no objective quantification of that weight, measurement of that weight, or agreement on a trigger point which would initiate driver welfare facility provision.
Seems to me that exercise is really quite important.
I would agree, yes.
We know if it is being done by anyone? Jack? Jesper?
Do we know?
Sounds to me as if there's something radically wrong. I mean, we've heard these comments from you. It's perfectly obvious that there is no real work being put into it. I just don't understand why it is that solutions are not being found, that this is not exactly the world's biggest logjam in the world. I mean, it just is not. So what is it that's... Well, I'm not going to ask you a further question as you've already been asked, but I am going to suggest to you that we are going to have to take some quite strong action to get people to realise we need an emergency solution, and we need a working party or something. We need some evidence that the people who are responsible for making these decisions are actually going to do something about it. It's astonishing to listen to you and to see...
And if I may, Chairman, it's not only a question of inconvenience to individuals, there's also the question of freight that you mentioned. I mean, how many additional lettuces would wilt? Has that been thought about?
That's my question.
And also the knock-on disruption to businesses and communities in Kent. Visit Kent carried out its business barometer survey in August 23, and a number of the businesses who responded to that reported that Operation Brock had a detrimental impact on their business through footfall, if you were a visitor attraction, but also revenue as well. So it is an issue that does have consequences. Chair, I wouldn't want you thinking that no one is working on this. People have been working on it. Logistics UK is a member of the Kent Resilience Forum, but I just think we need to bring a sharper focus to this issue, given that there's pre-existing vulnerabilities and fragilities, and then on top of that we're going to have quite considerable change, particularly at the juxtaposed border.
Right, well, I think we've got the message, so we'll try and do something about it at our end. So next question is Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. Chair, it's not a declaration of interest as such, but Miss Mallon and I were old sparring partners back in Belfast. You recognise the accent, so it's great. It's great to see her. It's great to see the other panellists too, but it's great particularly to see Nichola. I want to ask about, because we've talked about implementation, talked about some of the restrictions there are and your understanding as to how it's going to roll out. but have you got an appreciation at this stage of the obligations you or your members, your company would be under to implement the EES? So, I mean, hauliers perhaps first, ferry, passenger transport second. What obligations are being put on you to implement a scheme for which you're raising quite a number of concerns about the implementation of it, but what obligations would you be under to administer that scheme?
I suppose from our industry's perspective, it really will be trying to deal with the consequences in terms of traffic congestion and delay that is caused by kind of the processing of passengers. For our industry, there are particular considerations around driver hours rules, for example. That it is quite strict. There are some marginal flexibilities, but you have to meet a number of conditions. So it has to be an extreme and unforeseen event. There has to be no risk to road safety. There has to be automatic recording. If we do have a situation where there is continual and obvious disruption and delay, then businesses are going to have to factor that in terms of their drivers' scheduling. It's the same as the rule for the 90 in 180 days. Again, if you're a UK driver that's going across to Calais, for example, with a high level of frequency, or you're involved in music tours, for example, and there are considerable delays, you could find yourself falling foul of that particular rule. But again, the responsibility for that will be largely picked up by the logistics operator in planning their business, their routes and their drivers' hours. So they would be key practical considerations in respect of our industry.
Thank you. And Mr. Steer, in terms of passengers, obviously it'll be the individual's obligation, right? But how much of that do you believe you'll have to assist with? Do you feel an obligation in assisting your passengers to make sure they are compliant to travel, rather than try to sort it out last minute? And do you feel, or have you considered the implication this will have for last minute purchases and passengers who decide, let's skip across for a ferry run or a fag run or whatever it might be,
day out,
a wine run? Yeah,
exactly.
So,
all of those things,
yes,
hopefully.
yeah.
All of those. Yes, we have. This has been something that's been coming for some time. So from a customer communications point of view, whether it is with our freight customers or our tourist customers in this example, yes, we would, as we do today, always keep them informed of the legislative, if I can say the word, legislative needs that they would have to comply with as they come through the port. From a technical point of view and from our IT perspective, it is, to be fair, quite a light touch for us, because we are the end part of the process. All of the testing, etc., for EES is done way before they get to us. So we will be ready from a technical point of view, and from a training point of view for our teams and our people, we will be ready as well. So all of those elements of EES, we are in effect comfortable with. It's the upstream element of it that we've spent a lot of time talking about today, where we believe the concerns are from a legislative technical point of view.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Christensen.
Yeah, similar. I mean, of course, we look after our passengers. So, if this comes in, it's not really us as the operator who has to manage it. That will be the border. But if, for instance, it is some kind of digital registrations, like your API for your passport today that you send to the airlines, that will be similar. That we would have to develop something to capture this data. If this was the way that the whole control would go. Normal situation, we will keep our passengers informed about it. Also, what are the queuing time? Should you arrive early? Should you not arrive early? These kind of things, and we will of course need to strengthen that if we see more frequent block-ins to it. As part of the EES, there's also a travel visa for non-visa people, the ETIAS coming in, and of course that part will have to be the operators that has to manage that part. So when passenger books, we have to verify that they indeed have the necessary travel documents for them, and that will be digital, which means it's no good showing us your passport when you arrive. We will need to get that information from you in advance. So again, we need to develop our systems. UK is also in the process of developing something similar, so we will of course have to try to make sure that we capture all the data in the right order and send them to the people who want it, which of course just from a small concern makes our system a little vulnerable, because we have to send to so many and collect so much data at the moment.
Have concerns been raised about the security of that data and ability for you to transmit back and forth through the various embassies or whoever it is?
We of course have to run by the GDPR rules for what kind of data we even store in our system. So there's certain system we cannot store, and also a lot of system or data we scrap as soon as we are finished with it. And yes, we have of course also spoken to it. And today, UK government and French government, of course, cannot just share data. They have the same issues, and us sharing with, for instance, the British authorities or the French authorities also comes with certain caveats that we have to meet certain things about encrypting all the data and things like that. So and also not, should we say, open backdoors into our system, by giving people open-ended access to our system. So.
Okay. I'm almost driven to think that there ought to be some competition that should be set up to solve this problem. I know that occasionally when big inventions have been baffling people, and this is where I don't know whether my colleagues think the same as I do, but I see this situation, which is fundamental and needs to be resolved. There must be somebody out there with the brains to be able to work this one through and to come up with really coherent answers. So I am going to put on the record that if it were possible to find some academic university research group or whatever it is, somebody's got to come up with this. I mean, you're baffled yourselves, I think, noticing the fact that you've got a deadline and all these sort of things. Somehow there's got to be a solution. And at the moment, the evidence that we've been getting over the last weeks and so forth suggests to me that there are problems, there are potential solutions, but there isn't one at the moment. So I'm just going to put that on the record. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that, but I think it'd be worth somebody...
If I was allowed to comment on it, Chair, when we were talking, or you asked earlier about our concerns about the deadline and should it be a year or something like that, the way it's been postponed sort of tells at least us, and I'm talking from my own personal, is that there isn't a solution, and that is why they keep postponing it. And the postponement that they have put in has been for, I wouldn't call it dubious reason, but the Olympics and also a EU tournament suggest that the real solution has not presented itself yet from a technological standpoint. And of course, EU has the, should we say, the downside of 28 member states trying to agree to this software. So I would welcome if we could find one that could just make it for us that would work. That would be.
If I may, Chairman, I'm finding it almost impossible to understand why the European Union would put in place a process that's impossible to implement. It does seem a very strange thing to do.
I'm sure you can pick up from my accent that I am not from UK, I come from Denmark, so
I thought you were Welsh
and
too.
we support EU heavily. So, but I shall not comment on that.
But it is rather odd. I mean, your industries must be very frustrated that this system has been put in place by the European Union from on high, and yet there is no practical means of implementing it. That's the fact of the matter, isn't it?
Not speaking for all the operators, we like the idea of digital borders, but a lot of times the border is everything but digital. It is digital until you get to the border. Now you have to get your passport out. Now you have to get your documents out. All these kind of things. So we really like the idea of digitalizing more and putting more in that we could do. We use the term upstream, but at least we could take it offline so we can have a smooth process by the time you arrive, and especially ensuring that everybody that arrives are ready to travel, have the right documents and are good to travel, and the authorities agree with that.
It's a wonderful idea, provided you got the kit to make it work, and we haven't.
Right.
That's the position, isn't it?
If I may, and I think that is absolutely right. That's the key point. It goes back to my example where we're talking about the difference between the sanitised environment where the technology works in an airport versus what we as operators, hauliers, etc., have to deal with in Dover Port. It is a very different environment. So the inception of this, it does feel like, was not created considering all of the elements that would need to be dealt with using these future checks. And so that is one of the reasons why we're sitting in front of you and imploring you to support us in this deadline challenge in what the technological solution is. I think it's a brilliant idea, Chair, by the way, about trying to find some genius that has this eureka moment that comes up.
Well, it sounds almost slightly bizarre, but actually I know these things have been resolved in the past when there have been, everybody else who's in the system can't find an answer, and somebody from outside the system takes a look at the whole thing, and then suddenly you do have a eureka moment sometimes. Let's just hope for the best. But I put it on the record. Okay.
Thank you.
So, David, is that...
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is Mr. Drax, please.
Well, I think you've thrashed this question to pieces, because it is regarding the technology and IT necessary to do what we're all discussing here today. So, do you have anything further to add? And I suspect the answer to that is probably no. And I know you've mentioned the...
couldn't have put it better.
And you've mentioned the creation of an app, which I think you thought might go some way to resolve the issue. So I'm not quite sure, unless you want to say any more, you can say any more about the difficulties of the technology and all the things you need to make it work simply.
Mr. Drax, I suppose my question back would be, have we made it clear enough? That is the solution as we see it.
I think you have. So, back to you.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I'm now going to move on to Greg Smith.
Thanks, Chairman. Notwithstanding that we don't have all the detail of how to actually implement this thing, of course, particularly to to P&O and to DFDS, your customers do not consider themselves customers of the Port of Dover, just as a British Airways customer does not consider themselves a customer of Heathrow or Gatwick or Stansted or wherever. So there's going to be a cost to implement this. That cost will largely be borne by the port, but then you'll have to pay through your fees that which is going to have an impact on your passengers and the vehicles using your services for tourism or business travel or freight or whatever it might be. What do you think that cost is actually going to end up being on your average Eurocamp trip into France by the holidaymakers, or an HGV taking a load into France or further afield? What's it actually going to cost people?
Anybody wants to? If I may, I think it's a little early for us until we've actually seen what it is that the port has to implement, and also what we have to implement, to put a number to it. But you're right in the sense that if the port is forced to build infrastructure and also employ a number of people to do this, there's only one way that they can sort of fund that, and that will be through the tariff into the operators, and then we will have to pass it out. We also have to remember that there's a very tough competition going on. We can sit here and be nice with each other, but it is really a tough competition, and not just in the port, but with all modes of transport. So it might sound easy enough to say that we will add a fiver to your ticket or anything, but it may not work that way. So.
Any more clarity on anything in your budgets that you're planning on?
No, not at this point. I think Jesper has been very eloquent in the way and very kind in the way he's put that across. At this moment in time, I don't think we have a true view on what the potential cost would be. The point we have to, I think, as an operator, from a commercial point of view, is that Jesper is 100% correct. It's a challenging market on the short straits. There are 3 operators. We've got Eurotunnel just down the road. Price is really, really sensitive. It will be very, very difficult for us to move prices because of an introduction of something like EES. I think it is a really big question that we will have to face into over the coming months. But from all of our point of view, protecting market share, protecting our business is vitally important. But we have to consider what a consumer, whether that be a freight customer or whether that be a tourist passenger, is prepared to pay for our product. So again, for all of the reasons we've talked about, how we make this work in the best possible way, not just from a roads point of view, from a throughput point of view, but from an economical point of view, is hugely important for all of us.
Okay, so David Jones has the next question. It really intrigues me because we've heard about how it's incredibly difficult to get all this to work, and certainly within the timetable. But now, David, you're going to ask what thoughts for me is becoming the big question.
Well, yes, a practical question, really, and Nichola, I think, is probably the best place to answer it. Could you explain, in practical terms, how the movement of goods between the UK and the EU works?
At the moment?
Yes, particularly via the ports of Dover and Folkestone.
Yeah, so I think Port of Dover recently released figures to show that there's about £144 billion worth of trade, and that's UK-EU. So you're talking about just over 30% of trade going through that route, so it is a key route. As I said, it's a key route for the critical just-in-time supply chain as well. So there isn't much room for delay. Just-in-time means that the goods have to keep moving. It's critical, and the more that they're held up, the lesser value that they are, so it's quite significant. At the minute, it flows quite well, as I've said previously, where you do have peak passenger periods. I'm thinking of Easter break coming up. Then there are delays that freight picks the burden up on through Operation Brock. But in terms of kind of cost and how things are moving, as I said, our members are largely operating under very tight profit margins.
And what sort of checks take place on goods that are moved in via these ports?
So at the moment, checks are conducted on goods that are exported to the EU, but under the Border Target Operating Model from the 31st of January this year, new import controls are being introduced throughout this year. So that will create a new process. And it will also incur an additional charge. We are still waiting on confirmation from Cabinet Office about the common user charge, so that's the level of charge per consignment to go through the government-run border control post at Sevington. But that will be an additional cost that will have to be factored into logistics operators' business plans, and it will add a degree of friction because if you're importing SPS goods and you need to go to Sevington for checks, that's an additional journey that you don't have to undertake at the moment. So all of that comes into play.
What the checks look like? I mean, what are the checks?
Well, you'll get export health certificate checks, you will get some physical checks, but at the moment they're all happening on the EU side. Yes. At the moment, there is no real controls or checks as you are importing agri-food produce from the EU into the UK, but as I've said, that is changing incrementally throughout the year.
So again, just for the sake of clarity, what would a check look like? I mean, would people actually go onto the lorries? Would goods be taken off the lorries?
No, so what will happen is if I'm bringing a lorry across, I get a notification that as the driver I need to take it to Sevington for a physical check. I will then leave the Port of Dover, drive to Sevington for the check. If I clear the check, then I'll be able to go on to my point of destination.
Yes. But
there's also documentary checks that take place.
Presumably it's a random process.
Yes, it depends on the commodities that you're carrying in the back of your lorry and the risk categorisation as well, but there will be sampling checks done, yes.
There will be physical checks done?
Yes, on SPS goods. At Sevington, yes.
Yeah.
It is indicated by government that Sevington will be the border control post, yes.
Just one other question for the two gentlemen. We heard in evidence from Ryanair that the implementation of EES could have an impact upon last-minute ticket sales for short-haul flights. Do you anticipate anything like that might happen in respect of sea traffic?
I would hope not. I think it's one of those that it might be something that evolves through time if people see it as being problematic. But because of the way it's set out at the moment, actually, whether I am deciding to go for that trip across to Calais for a day, a week, or that last-minute moment, I'd still have to go through exactly the same process.
Yes, I appreciate that, but presumably if there are TV pictures of long queues in Kent.
Now, we do know that if there are challenges around whether it's EES or whether it's anything else, and you see those kind of TV pictures, of course that would make would make me consider what mode of transport do I want to take. That is a potential risk. But the process of going through EES, I don't believe would impact whether somebody decided to do that last minute trip or not.
Jesper?
Yeah, similar to Jack. What we will say is that it may be that you decide not to, but we will usually sort of advise our passengers, the ones we know about, that they should book in advance and also do their preparation in advance. But we do see a number of people who decides on a short break or a day trip showing up on the day wanting to buy a ticket. And here, if there are pictures, as Jack is saying, of long queues, that will definitely deter them from doing this kind of thing. If it's also become sort of common that there are queues in the port, that means that a day trip will not be as convenient anymore, and people may shine away for it. So that could be a concern for us. If that's the image that the port suddenly gets, that it's not so easy to get through anymore.
That's reputation, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And if I may come back on that, then that is absolutely the key point here, isn't it? Avoiding that kind of damage is what we all want to achieve. That flow of traffic in the way we would expect it to be today needs to be the same after the solution of VES goes in.
Thank you.
So, John Crowless, I think some of these points have been covered. But knowing your perceptive way of asking a question to cut through it.
No, it was on something that Nichola just talked about, which is about the new entry requirements for plant and animal products originating in the EU. And next month, that becomes physical checks. Yes. So sort of another layer of inspection and regulation. Yes. What have been the effects of the current checks from January, and what do you anticipate happening from April, really?
Yes, so in terms of the new controls around the requirement of an export health certificate from the 31st of January, government has been adopting an educative approach to enforcement. So I think we don't have a fully accurate picture from our perspective in terms of UK readiness or compliance. In terms of the physical checks that will be introduced from the 30th of April, that will be quite considerable. As I've said, if you're bringing a lorry of SPS produce across, it's considered to be high risk. You're selected for a check. You will have to take the vehicle.
Is that random, or will that be on every?
There will be a percentage. Yes, there will be percentages, is my understanding of checks. And if you're notified as a driver, you will then have to take your vehicle to Sevington, which is about 22 miles from the Port of Dover. So that will be an additional process, an additional time, and additional cost that you will have to factor into your journey. But it would be really important just to take the opportunity that we get confirmation on some of the outstanding decisions in relation to the border target operating model, particularly the common user charge. As you said, that's due to come into effect on the 30th of April. And if you're a smaller operator and you're being levied a charge on each of your consignments, right, it could have quite a significant impact. So the sooner that level of charge is made public, the more time that our members have to plan and prepare.
I think that covers it.
Okay, thank you very much. So, in a nutshell, what impact do you expect the entry-exit system to have on the movement of goods and on supply chains when it is fully implemented? Or is that yet another question that you can't really answer at the moment?
No, I think that as we've discussed in responses to previous questions, if it's implemented as is, then at peak passenger periods, there will be significant queues of traffic, and that will have a significant knock-on impact on freight. It will impact in terms of the just-in-time critical supply chain, because fresh produce, the longer it's in a lorry, will have a shorter shelf life, shorter value, and an increase in potential wastage. We could also see, when it's combined with the border target operating model, that there is a reduction on EU imports, for example, which could lead to reduced product availability, choice, and perhaps higher prices for UK consumers. And obviously there is the significant traffic impact, and then the knock-on implications for driver welfare as well. So they would be our key concerns as is.
It does seem to me that you're the ideal person to answer that question. Would that be right? And the others would defer to what you're saying, because you're the logistics person. So what products in particular? You mentioned fresh produce, but what other sort of particular products would you have in mind?
Well, if we look at exports, we export fresh fresh meat and shellfish from the north. We also take automotive parts across via the short straits to assembly lines in Europe and the continent as well. So you have implications in terms of the perishable foods that we are importing, but also the perishable just-in-time goods that we're also exporting, or any goods that are critical in terms of just-in-time delivery.
Also, there are, we know, delays at the port of Dover and at Folkestone, and some claim that this would turn Kent into a car park, and it may well be true, but if that were to happen, what risk does this perception of Kent present to travel and tourism through the port and the Eurotunnel?
I think that's a real risk. We just spoke about the potential of people wanting to book last minute but seeing pictures in newspapers, on their phones, on the TV, and making decisions around that. I think it poses real challenges for us. And therefore, the way that we go about managing through EES and the implementation of it is absolutely critical. I mean, Nichola makes a really good point when she's talking about the fact that it's various items that people see on the supermarket shelves today that potentially could be impacted. We have to consider the impact that therefore has on people's pockets and on UK PLC. I think I know that I am talking again about something as we've already spoken about, but the timelines that we're currently facing into, if we don't have the right solution, we have to be impressing upon everybody involved in this that those timelines just simply have to move out. I don't think it's a viable option for us to put something in place which is ultimately going to cause us challenges that we could avoid by simply giving ourselves some more time in order to be able to find the correct solution.
Right. Anybody got anything to add to that?
If I may, Chair, it was just when we talked after Brexit, there's been implemented a full customs border, and we are just seeing the last bit coming on the UK side now. But almost from day one, it was fully implemented over on the EU side. And yet we managed to solve it. Yes, it was a little bit bumpy, but all the hauliers has found a way around it. And especially the controls, the way it's done, the customs control are taken offline. They are not sitting in the port just off the ferry in big queues waiting for custom officers to go around and look at them and decide which one he wants to talk to. This is all pre-done. We advise the driver, both going into UK or going into France, who has to go and see customs. This is on a screen. So the controls is taken offline, all the other traffic goes in and can go straight on the road. So it's a little bit sad to see that this is now being disrupted only because we want some control on the passengers, but it's not really the goods that we want to control, it's the passengers, all the drivers, that is actually causing this hold-up. Because the system to move the freight from a customs perspective, that is in place. We can argue about cost of it, but it is in place, and the traffic still moves every day. And this is where we really need to contain that and make sure that they continue to move, and we don't end up setting some obstacle forward by blocking the roads with other traffic, or tourist traffic and things like that.
I mean, again, to come back to the point I keep coming back to anyway, there are other parts of the world where you would expect similar situations to be going on. Is there something intrinsically particular to the channel as between France and the United Kingdom, which makes it more difficult than it would be if it was between, shall we say, Singapore and China or Malaysia or something like that? I mean, I can't for the life of me think that the problems that you've explained, which are real to you because you're having to grapple with this the whole time, are not being replicated elsewhere in the world unless other people have come across solutions to the same kind of problems, and you are faced with a situation where you've got a piece of legislation which appears to emanate from the European Union, and there isn't a solution, but in other parts of the world you don't have the same degree of problem as far as we know. Do you have any thoughts on that as a comparison? Is there something intrinsic about the bureaucratic nature of what is being put through. It's not about Brexit, it's about whether or not there is a solution to a problem which appears to apply elsewhere in the world.
So, Chairman, one of the things we see is, of course, a very short crossing, which means that it's a very short time to make a decision. Who do you want to see, who do you not want to see, and also there's a finite amount of space on both sides where we can hold traffic. So we really wanted moving. As I was saying, the Brexit had brought in a customs border, and that is, to our mind at least, been solved. The practical side. That
happens in all parts of the world. There's nothing new about this.
But also for many years we have supplied API data, so passport data, for everybody going in of EU and out of EU, and also to UK. And that's same as any airlines does. And that has satisfied authorities in the past about, are you the right person to come in or not? So to us, we also, as we have tried to represent here, a little baffled about this suggestion of how it is to be implemented. And this is, as far as we can see, mainly hinged on some biometrics control or biometrics that needs to be taken. But all the other data and also the way of sending it and controlling it, that is already in place.
Okay, well, I'm now going to ask Greg Smith to ask the next question, please.
Thank you, Chairman.
You're 12 and 13, aren't you?
Yeah, we touched on some of these issues earlier, but Nichola, these are really for you about driver welfare and impacts on drivers. It's not a technical interest, but for transparency, I also chair the all-party parliamentary group for on-road freight and logistics in Parliament. So this is an issue I've come across outside the forum of this committee as well. If the car park scenario happens, which, face it, likely, and we're getting a lot of HGVs under Brock outside the perimeter of the port, how worried are you about the impact that's, notwithstanding the comment that was made earlier that, well, drivers are used to being out on the road, they can sleep in their cabs, etc., some of the wider welfare issues on drivers, which I think could be quite severe, and also the issue of thefts from those vehicles, because we're seeing across the country more generically issues with HGVs being broken into, curtains slashed, loads stolen. If we've suddenly got a not insignificant number of vehicles outside the secure perimeter of the port, how big a challenge is that going to be for the sector?
No, thank you for your interest in our industry. If I take the issue of theft, it is an increasing concern and of increasing prevalence in terms of members' experience. It is a particular concern if lorries are parked up and the driver isn't inside. We also have the issue, as you have said, of driver welfare. Brock is a moving queue. So while the driver is in the vehicle, you're reducing the possibility of theft, but the longer the driver is in the vehicle, then the more concerned we become for her or his welfare. As we've said, drivers are very self-reliant. They will have food and water, but they also require restroom facilities and a range of facilities that they don't have access to. And that's why one of the key issues that we need to address is how we can improve driver welfare facility. And I'll go back to the point about having a government-led way of tracking waiting times and having a threshold or a trigger whereby we step in terms of driver welfare provision as well. In terms of another impact on drivers, it was Gavin who had asked the question about the impact on our members, and one of the consideration has to be drivers' hours and making sure that drivers don't fall foul of that. As I've said, there can be marginal extension of your driver's hour, but it has to be an extreme and unforeseen event, and there are other conditions that are attached to that. If we have traffic congestion, which is a very well-known and foreseen reality as a result of new processes, then that does cause issues for drivers and for haulage companies as well.
The natural follow-on from that is the other big challenge for the sector right now, driver recruitment and retention.
Absolutely.
What is Logistics UK and that which you know about from others, Road Haulage Association, etc., predicting the impact of this could be on what is already quite a tricky situation?
Well, Logistics UK is involved with government in the Generation Logistics campaign. I know you're aware of it, and that's all about attracting new people into our industry. We do have an issue around driver shortages. We do have a challenge in terms of attracting new people and creating a more diverse workforce. But if you have scenes where you have large, long queues of lorries, drivers inside for considerable periods of time, how would that attract new people into the industry? So all of this is related. And as I said, haulage companies are operating under very difficult circumstances, very tight profit margins, operating costs have been increasing. They can't necessarily recruit that through revenue, so it is a challenging environment. If the images emerge, or the reality is that you do have to sit in queues for longer periods, you are subject to that disruption and delay, it certainly would impact on the attractiveness of the industry, which should be a concern not just for Logistics UK, but for UK PLC.
That's really helpful. Just before I ask Jack and Jesper to comment on this, what about the modelling around not just the just-in-time freight, but actually general bookings of movement of goods in and out of the UK? How big an issue do you think that is going to be in terms of being able to meet the end customer's expectation of when their box of goodies or whatever it might be will actually reach them in France or Belgium or coming back here to the UK?
Customers' expectation has increased over time, where they want products at maximum speed. So that creates a very competitive environment. The short straights is the route of choice because it is highly efficient and the high frequency of services. So the speed is a very real consideration and benefit. If we were to see delays and disruption, then that will impact on the benefits that are to be had, and certainly will put pressure on logistics companies who are trying to get the goods where they need to be in the shortest period of time.
That's helpful. Gentlemen, do you have anything to add to those observations?
Yeah, obviously Nichola has covered off a huge amount within that answer, but the one thing I would add to it from an operator's perspective is if you put yourself in the shoes of a lorry driver, one of the things and one of the reasons why they enjoy ferry travel is the amenities that are on board a ship. So if you consider a lorry driver, it's not just being able to go on, sit down, relax, get a drink, have something to eat. There are showers on board. They can refresh themselves. There are areas where they can actually have quiet time and have a rest, sleep, have a proper relax. So that delay to all of these things has a fundamental impact on their own personal journey, not only through Kent and off into Calais and through France and wherever it is they may be going, but it has a real-time impact on their overall well-being. And I think we need to constantly be considering how do we alleviate those challenges of time for all of our customers. And freight, as I say, our ships and as our DFDS ships, specifically designed to enable that welfare for those individuals on board our ships.
Just to echo that, and also to say that we don't trivialize the welfare of freight drivers in any way. When Brock comes in, as I'm saying, we don't particularly like Brock. Nobody likes them. To us, as Nichola is saying, is a rolling queue, which means the driver cannot stop and go climb in the back and go to sleep. And then it also means that certain drivers, sometimes they run out of hours and have to leave the queue, and then it means they have to rejoin it, and it just compound the issue. So, and of course, we want that queue as close to the port as possible. We don't really like a car park close to M25 because we need to be able to pull it when we need it. So to us, it's really that whatever solution it is that we are able to take it through the port as quickly as it is, so we don't have to have them sitting out on the motorway in any sort of period of time. So.
Thank you.
Okay, now last question. Are you concerned about the stricter imposition of the 90 days within the 180 days rule for non-EU freight and coach drivers due to EES? And how big of a problem is this 90/180 day limit for United Kingdom nationals who stay in the EU who are currently drivers for freight companies? Is this something you've come across, and what is the nature of the problem? Could you give us a comment?
So we don't sort of see it as much because we of course doesn't know how our passengers are moving in and out of EU, whether they are falling foul of it or but with the new rules, of course, as a non-Schengen person, you would have to have a little bit of consideration for how you travel, because you could fall foul of it if you travel regularly. And here at the moment, where the system is by wet stamping passports, a lot of our staff who travel quite frequently have run out of pages in their passport in very short period of time, and they're only in there for a little bit. So there are some consideration that especially coach drivers that runs these regular routes in and out will have to look at. And also some people who travel for business, if they also want to go on holiday, they just need to keep their eye on how many days they are. But It's not really something that we can see from...
Any other comment on that? No?
All I would just add is that for the UK hauliers, if there is considerable delay and disruption, that will have to be factored in, and it will impact drivers who are over with high levels of frequency, or, for example, drivers who are involved in music tours or businesses that are on tour around the European Union. So I suppose from our perspective, it would be an added consideration that logistics companies have to factor in terms of their scheduling of their drivers and routes.
Good. Well, my final point, it comes back to what I've already said, because there do seem to be difficulties which appear to be somewhat intractable. On the other hand, I'm an optimist, and I'm just wondering if you, between the three of you, and also in discussions that you could have after this session with some other people who you know might have novel ideas as to how to work out solutions for this problem, and maybe you could talk to one another and then come back to us with a sort of a joint letter or something and say, well, could you suggest, for example, there may be some sort of mega, extremely well-known organisation which has experience of this kind of thing. Some of the international comparisons seem to me to be worth looking at. I think I said Singapore and China. I think it's more Singapore and Malaysia, actually, if I could put it that way around. But anyway, the point is there are other comparable situations where you would have thought that they would have this situation in the rest of the world. And it just seems to me that it's worth looking at that. If you could put your heads together and maybe write us a letter and just suggest something along these lines, we can take it up with the government.
Yes, shall I take that? Chair, thank you. Yeah, I would welcome the opportunity to do that in conjunction with the other partners that are involved.
Yes, whoever else you feel is appropriate.
Absolutely right. I think we have to do that through our partners in Dover Harbour Board. But yes, of course, we would all welcome the opportunity.
We don't want a sort of 30-page analysis to be presented. What we really want is to actually get people's heads together to try and work out whether there is a solution to this, and if there isn't, then to go back to the source of the problem, which is the manner in which the EES system has been put together. But that's another problem for another day. But thank you all very much for coming, and look forward to receiving your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you all of you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.